Hopefully everyone can see me. As Lucas and Jacob said, my name is Megan Haas. I am currently the chef at the Settle Down Tavern. If you haven't heard of us, we're a relatively new restaurant, opened in May of 2020, so it's a pandemic baby. We're just a block off Capitol Square, trying to be a modern version of a classic Wisconsin tavern. All that said, most of what I'm going to be doing today is really not going to be related to Settle Down at all, but a lot of my food philosophy I will be sharing tonight, and that does, of course, impact what we do at Settle Down as well. So I've got what I hope for you to get out of the evening tonight is to have a little bit more in your toolbox for how to cook well, how to eat well, without having to spend $1 million on it a week. We all know that food cost, in particular in the last year or two, really since the pandemic, has been going crazy. And so it's more important than ever that we want to be able to put good food into our body, food that we feel good about and that's going to nourish us and make us able to tackle our days, but without costing an insane amount of money. So I have really 5 takeaways that I think are good principles for you to follow. I'm going to start by just going over those takeaways at the beginning so you kind of have an overview of where I'm going. And then we're going to start cooking. And I'll try to connect back to those takeaways so you can kind of have examples of what I mean when I'm talking about these things. So the 5 takeaways that I have, number 1 is going to be that you want to cook with, already I'm getting myself all flustered. It's been a while since I've done something like this. So let me look at my notes for a second. So number 1, you want to cook with whole ingredients whenever you possibly can. And by whole ingredients, I mean, for example, fresh beans, like dried beans rather than like a prepared bean product. I mean, regular, plain, unadulterated yogurt, not yogurt that has 1,000 different ingredients in it so that it's cookies and cream yogurt. Whenever possible, you want to be buying that whole vegetable. You want to buy the whole ingredient and then get as much as you possibly can out of it. Instead of buying things that have all these additives that you don't really know what's in there, a bunch of stuff that was maybe not grown in the best way, etc. So cook from whole ingredients whenever you possibly can. It's going to be cheaper and it's going to be better for you. Number 2 is to cook from local sources if you can, and to try to cook seasonally. That is tied to cooking from those whole ingredients, but it also hits on even more things such as like the sustainability of what you're eating, making sure that you're eating the best ingredients that you possibly can, things that taste way better, and then also putting money back into your own community, ideally, putting money behind people who are making the right choices, who are raising meat responsibly, for example, who are growing apples that are only like 30 miles from where you live. And then also cooking seasonally. So for example, we're just starting apple season, which is one of my favorite times of the year because apples are just a beautiful food. The reason that matters is because number 1, it allows you to buy from local sources, which, like we said, allows you to put your money places where you can be proud of. But also it's just going to taste a heck of a lot better. One of the best examples of that is tomatoes. We've all seen tomatoes in grocery stores year round. But you may, if you've ever done any gardening yourself or been to some farmers markets or what have you, you might know that tomato season is really not that long here in Wisconsin. You get about 2 months where tomatoes are actually ripe here in Wisconsin. And if you've had one of those local tomatoes that has been raised in actual dirt, and compare that to like a Roma tomato that you get from the grocery store in January, it does not even taste like the same vegetable. It's so much richer, so much like savory umami flavor, so like juicy and just a perfect vessel, as opposed to that grocery store tomato that's honestly just going to taste kind of like a wet sponge. So cooking with that local seasonal ingredient is always going to taste better and give you much more nutrition and better bang for your buck. Number 3 takeaway is going to be to do some meal prep on whatever days off you have. Set yourself up for success throughout the course of the whole week by doing a couple of hours of work on your weekend or whatever days off you have. Why does that matter? Well, if you're anything like me, even somebody who loves cooking, that's what I do all day long because I love cooking. But if I spend a whole day at work, I'm simply not going to come home and then spend a couple of hours cooking something from scratch. You just don't have the energy to. And that is when I at least fall into that trap of ordering out, ordering some pizza, whatever, making choices that are going to be much less financially responsible and also much less good for you. But if you do meal prep and have a bunch of those components kind of ready to go, it's so much easier to make better choices. For a lot of people, meal prep looks like actually preparing an entire meal so that all you have to do on your weeknight or whatever is to heat it up and eat it. And that's great. If that works for you, I completely love that. For me, I get a little bit bored if I have the same meal for more than one day in a row. So what I like to do is to have a couple of components that are ready to go that I can then combine in different ways. I can still be creative. I can push it in different ways depending on what I feel like that night. But if I already have my beans cooked, my rice cooked, I've already got a bunch of roasted veggies ready, I've got some pulled chicken in the fridge, then it only maybe takes me 10 or 15 minutes to pull together something that's still home cooked and still absolutely delicious. But I don't have to spend all night doing it on the night that I want to eat it. So meal prep is super important. Number 4 of my 5 takeaways is going to be to reduce waste. It's better for the planet, but it's also better for your wallet if you're actually getting everything out of the food that you possibly can. In America, I think we throw away something like 30% of the food that's grown here, which is just terrible and sad. But finding ways to use up all of the food that you have, use every component of the thing that you're buying and turn it into something delicious and good for you is going to be a much better way to run your home kitchen. A huge part of that is going to be learning to be flexible and to combine ingredients in different ways. For a long time, I used to cook just from a recipe from the internet or wherever my cookbook or wherever I found it. But if you are only following like a staid recipe, then you're going to feel like you have to run to the grocery store to get every single ingredient. It has to be exactly what the recipe author said, and you're going to end up not using up everything. Whereas if you learn to be a little bit more flexible, which is very difficult, it's a difficult skill, but if you learn to be flexible and to use up everything that you have, then all of a sudden you can actually use every component of what you have bought. And that is a great way to reduce the amount of money that you're spending overall on food. All right. And one more takeaway, and then I promise we're going to get started cooking. My last takeaway is just to have fun with it. Food is a super important thing that we all do. We all have to eat in order to live, but it's also fun and it should be playful. As adults, a lot of us don't have opportunities to be creative and playful in our daily lives, but food can be that. Like you can play around, you can do whatever you want. And maybe sometimes it's not going to work, but it's probably still going to be edible. And you know what? You're going to learn something from it and you're going to get better at it. And maybe next time you'll have a better product. And you probably also have a funny story, even if it doesn't work. So those are kind of my 5 main points on how you can save money and also cook really well. That said, I do want to get some of my food going. I have one item in particular that is a little bit time sensitive for us, so I want to get that one going. And it's going to be beans, actually. So my beans that I have is actually in my Instant Pot right now. You can kind of see, I'll tilt my camera a little bit. I've just got a pound of dry pinto beans in here. And then you also see this, this white chunk is actually some lard. So that's going to be pork fat. And I've got a couple of leaves of bay in there as well as some salt that I've already tossed in my Instant Pot to kind of, I hope you forgive me for cheating a little bit and saving a little bit of time by getting those things ready. I'm going to put one more thing in there, which is going to be chicken stock. Now, why am I using an Instant Pot for this? It's because honestly, it's extraordinarily convenient. So you can certainly cook these beans however you like. Stovetop is a wonderful way to cook beans as well. It just takes longer. And especially if you're cooking from dry, you frequently are going to want to soak your beans overnight. Well, with an Instant Pot instead, you can still have dry beans, but you can cook them from dry in your Instant Pot in like 35 minutes, which is amazing. Beans are one of the things that I like to meal prep on the weekends, but it's also something that you can pull off on a weeknight. If you need beans for dinner, you can still just throw them in an Instant Pot and they're ready to go. As you saw me do, I just put a couple of like flavoring compounds in there, some moisture. Chicken stock is what I use just because it's going to give you a little bit more flavor, but you can also use water or veggie stock or whatever you like. Just toss it in the Instant Pot and let it do the work for you. We can then come back and adjust the seasonings once it's done cooking, but the majority of the work is just going to happen in the background while I'm working on other things, which is wonderful, wonderful. Tying it back to some of those takeaways, again, like I'm using those whole ingredients, right? I'm using whole beans without any sort of additives that I didn't personally add. And again, it's a great meal prep item for you to have. And you can use it in a million different ways. Who doesn't love beans? It's also a great source of fiber and of protein, especially if you are not a huge meat eater. Beans are a very, very clutch item for you. All right, so we've got our beans going. They're going to come up to pressure behind us, and it might make a lot of noise a little bit later, but hopefully it's not too distracting. Next, I want to get started on our carnitas. Now, I wanted to cook carnitas for you because carnitas are like one of the best dishes in the world, in my opinion. Pork is just a beautiful, beautiful meat, and carnitas is a wonderful preparation of it. It's also not terribly difficult, and it can be pretty much as simple as you want it. I'm going to be doing it on my stovetop, but you can also do it in you could do it in an Instant Pot. You could do it in a crock pot, whatever works for you. Again, have fun with it. Just do whatever works for you. Be flexible, and learn every time you do it. So I'm going to get started on my pork. I'll give you a little bit of a better view of the pork. Apologies for the wiggly camera. I'm just going to kind of zoom in for you. You see how beautiful that pork shoulder is? It's like really nice and red, almost the color of beef. That's what pork looks like when it's raised well, when it's actually a healthy animal before it's harvested. This pork actually comes from Greenfire Farm that Jacob owns. And it's one of the great ways for you to, again, to buy locally and support someone who you know is doing the right thing. I'm going to start breaking this down. So this is a bone-in pork shoulder. So I'm going to have to cut around the bone and kind of cut my pork into little pieces. That might be kind of scary for you if that's not something that you do regularly, but my best advice is just get in there, get your hands in there. What's the worst that can happen? Cut safely. Don't cut your fingers off, but just give it a shot. For carnitas in particular, it doesn't need to be any sort of like really beautiful, crazy cut. We just want to get it kind of cubed up into small-ish pieces. So I'm just kind of cutting my way around the bone. Because this is a shoulder, I'm actually cutting around the shoulder bone of the pig. So you just want to get your knife in around the bone. I really like using a boning knife like this that's nice and flexible. So you can kind of use it to get around the bone, let the flexing of the knife actually do a lot of the work for you. And then just kind of feel your way in with your fingers so you can tell where the bone is and where you need to cut. I am certainly no expert butcher, so this is not going to be a perfect deboning. And that's okay. It doesn't need to be. It just needs to not have bone in it by the time I cook it. So here we go. The other thing that's really, really nice about buying a bone-in pork shoulder is, again, finding ways to use up everything that you have bought. So I'm not going to get rid of this pork bone. I'm not going to throw that in the trash. I'm going to hang on to it so I can collect a bunch of bones, and then I'll make stock later on. And then you can use stock in almost everything that you cook. We used a little bit of chicken stock in those beans earlier from a previous project that I've worked on. You can also, if you've ever had like ham hock with beans, it's more of a southern dish, but it is beautiful, and we're especially coming up on like soupy, stewy season. So that's a great one to have in your back pocket. All right. So I'm just working my way around the shoulder bone. It is quite a large bone. So like I said earlier, you just want to kind of feel your way through it and then get in there. I'm also mostly holding my knife in what's called a pistol grip. It's the way you would hold a knife if you were trying to murder someone, but that's not what we're doing. It just gives you, it feels very foreign the first time you hold your knife that way, but it gives you a little bit better control when you're cutting meat, especially when you're trying to get around bones or things like that. All right, we're getting closer. So the way that I'm preparing carnitas tonight is not necessarily the most traditional. Carnitas is also a dish that everyone in Mexico makes, so everyone has their own variation on it. But again, there's no rules. Just go ahead and have fun. The most traditional ways of preparing carnitas actually don't have a ton of ingredients in there. It's kind of a simple dish, really. But most of the best things in this world are. We're first going to cook it really low, and we're going to cook it in its own fat. Because we are cooking it in fat, essentially, and trying to slow cook it, what we're really doing is like a confit, which is just a French word for like cooking in fat. What that's going to do is it's going to render out a lot of the fat and the connective tissue that's in the pork. You can kind of see now that I've broken into it that we do have like a lot of connective tissue in there. If you don't give that time to break down, it can be really chewy and unpleasant. But by cooking it really slowly, we give that a chance to all soften and turn into just a beautiful, like gelatinous, wonderful mouthfeel. But the really, really excellent thing about carnitas is that we then at the end will also cook it at a little bit of a higher heat. So we also get beautiful little crispy bits on there too. So you get the meat that's like so tender it just falls apart, but you also get the little crispy bites. And there's really very few things that are better in this world, in my opinion. It does take quite a long time. So this batch of carnitas that I'm preparing right now won't be done in the amount of time that we're cooking together, but I did plan ahead, and I have a separate batch of carnitas that I prepared earlier today that's going on my back burner, so I can show you what it looks like once it is done as well. So you see me cutting with this giant knife. This is a breaker, I think is what you technically call it. You certainly don't need to have a knife this big and scary, but it is fun if you do. So I'm just cutting the pork into little chunks, about 1 to 2 inch cubes each. They're gonna shrink a lot once you cook them. As the moisture kind of gets driven out of the pork, it'll shrink a lot. So they don't need to be super tiny, but we just want to get them into little chunks so they can kind of cook somewhat evenly with each other. What I'm preparing is I think it's about a 4-pound shoulder, which is a really nice amount. That's gonna, again, for meal prep, it's gonna take you at least a few days worth of meals if you've only got a few folks in your house. And then you can use it in so many different ways. Probably my favorite way is going to be a taco, but that's just because tacos are one of the most universal foods. You can do anything you want in a taco, and it's almost always going to be delicious. You could also just cook off some rice and beans and eat that. You can make a quesadilla. You can make like an enchilada bake. You can make an egg taco in the morning and put a little bit of carnita on it. What literally your imagination is the only limiting factor here. And that, again, for me, is what I love about meal prep, because I don't have to eat the same thing for days on end. All right, I've got just a little bit more here. As I'm cutting, you also want to be cutting across the grain when you are cutting up meat. It's just going to help it fall apart a little bit better when you're eating it with a fork. That's not quite so crucial here because I am cutting it into cubes. So the odds of one of those cuts not being across the grain is pretty low. But just a good practice in general when you're cutting meat. So I'm going to take all of that pork shoulder that I just cut up, and it's going to go straight into my Dutch oven here that I have on the stove top. I'm going to get my knives and everything out of my way and wash my hands really quickly. And then we're just going to add a couple more ingredients to this as well. There is plenty of intramuscular fat in a pork shoulder, which is one of the reasons that I love pork shoulder so much. But because we're trying to kind of cover this in its own fat so that it cooks slowly, I actually am going to add even more lard to this. Lard is pork fat. So I'm going to add more lard just to make sure that there's enough moisture in here to cover the meat as it's cooking slowly. This is lard that I got from my local butcher. You can also use other forms of oil if you prefer. That's totally fine, whatever you have. I just really, really love the flavor of lard. So we've got lard in there, and then I'm going to get my heat going. I'm going to start at a relatively high heat, about medium high, just so that everything in there can get kind of melty and going. But then I'm going to drop the heat. Like we talked about earlier, we really need this pork to cook very slowly in order for it to get tender. This is going to take like 2 or 3 hours, maybe even 4. Don't rush it. It'll be so much better if you give it the time it needs to get tender. You might get scared after about an hour or 2. The pork is going to kind of like get really tense. It's going to look like it's going to be really chewy. Just give it more time. Let it keep going. It's going to fall apart and be just phenomenal. I'm cutting up an orange over here, and that's just going to go straight in the pot as well, the whole pieces. We're going to remove that before we eat it, but you've got so much flavor going on in that orange that is going to slowly release as this pork does its thing. I'm also going to put an onion in there, and I'm just going to give this a rough chop. I'm going to peel off the skin and then cut it into a couple of chunks and just stick that right in the pot as well. There are very few savory dishes that you will ever cook that do not have onions in them. And that's because they're nearly universal. Onions and garlic are nearly universal, and it's because they're so good. All right. There we go. We got all the skins off. I'm just going to chunk that up a little bit more. and toss them in. I've only got a couple more ingredients that are going to go in here. And honestly, a lot of actual Mexican cooks won't even put as much in here as I'm doing. But I just like what all of these components add in terms of flavor, just a little bit more complexity without overpowering it. You don't want to go crazy. You don't want to cover the flavor of the actual pork. You just want it to kind of accentuate it. Citrus and pork is a particularly beautiful combination. It makes the pork taste like even porkier in this amazing way. All right. I am also going to add a couple of like spices. I really, really love cinnamon, especially in Mexican cooking. It's really delightful. It's one of those things that like you don't consciously register it as cinnamon, but when you put it in a dish that you want to taste like a little bit Mexican inspired, it's really going to round it out and add a lot of that flavor. Another thing, my last ingredient actually is going to be chipotles, dried chipotles. This is very much not traditional for carnitas, but I just really, really love them. So I'm going to put them in. Dried chilies are the backbone of Mexican cooking, and they are dirt cheap and a phenomenal way to add flavor to anything you're doing. So I've got those in there. The very, very last thing, I lied earlier about the last ingredient, is going to be salt. You want to salt almost everything that you cook, and you likely should be adding more salt than you currently are. A good rule of thumb for meat is if you have the weight of your meat, to add about 2% of that weight in salt. Once you get comfortable with how much salt to add, you can kind of eyeball it if you like. I rarely measure salt if I'm not cooking for a professional setting anymore. But that is, the 2% is a really good rule of thumb until you do kind of get the hang of how much you want to add. Another really good piece of advice is going to be to keep tasting whatever you're cooking, just always, and keep adding salt until like it really pops. Salt and acid are going to be the two things that you can adjust for seasoning that make almost anything taste better. If you have like a really good foundation of a dish, but it just doesn't taste quite, like it just isn't punchy enough, it just doesn't taste quite the way you want it to, usually you can fix that with just salt and some form of acid. It tastes so much better. And if you get into the habit of tasting as you go, you'll learn how to moderate what you're adding, and you'll learn how to control that a little bit better until you're consistently putting out just really, really tasty food. So I'll give you a look at what our pot is doing. It's just coming up to heat right now. That lard is starting to melt. You see it doing its thing. And like I said, that's going to be hanging out for a couple of hours at least. Now, through the magic of planning, we do have that other pot of carnitas going. So I'm going to show you what it looks like now. Looks so good, doesn't it? It's got the beginnings of all those little crispy bits that I was talking about earlier. And it's so tender, it just breaks apart at the lightest pressure, but it's still got like that little crispy bite. I just love carnitas, it's so good. I really, really hope you all cook yourselves some carnitas. All right, I'm gonna put a lid on our pot that we just got going so that it can start on its journey and start to hang out. All right, that was a lot of the heavy lifting that we've done already. I've got just 2 more things that I want to show you how to prepare, and specific reasons for why I want to prepare each of them. The first one is going to be that chipotle aioli. So aioli is just a fancy word for mayo, really. But don't be scared of mayo. Mayo is delicious. Aioli is delicious. And especially if you learn how to cook it yourself. It's actually incredibly easy to make mayo if you've got the right tools. And then you never have to buy the stuff at the grocery store again, where you're not really sure what's in it. You're not really sure if it's good, like whatever. Like it takes 2 minutes to make a good aioli. So what I'm unwrapping right here, this is called an immersion blender. It's one of my favorite tools in the kitchen. I absolutely love having an immersion blender. But you don't have to. You can also use like any kind of like food processor or blender, anything like that is going to work as well. I just really love the convenience of an immersion blender because I can just stick it in whatever container I'm working on, push the button, and it'll blend it. I also, because I work in a professional kitchen, I have started to use these deli quart containers. Excellent food storage vessel. If you are unhappy with your current Tupperware situation in your cabinet, I really recommend investing in a bunch of these quart containers. It's good for food prep, it's good for food storage, it's really an all-purpose utility vehicle. Our mayo is going to start with 1 egg. So I'm going to crack that egg right into the bottom of my quart container. And again, talking about like those nice ingredients, the color in the camera isn't quite as good as it is in person, but the color of this yolk is like almost orange because that chicken was a happy, healthy chicken when it was laying its egg. The darker the color of the yolk, the healthier the chicken was. I'm also going to put a little squirt of mustard into my quart container, and I also put a little bit of squirt of mustard on the floor, but that's a problem for later, Megan. Mustard just helps emulsify because a mayo is actually just an emulsification of a fat, and the mustard helps bring that all together so that it's like a cohesive, thick mayo. I also need a little bit of lemon juice. So I've got a half of a lemon here, and I'm just going to juice that into the bottom. And then I need 2 more things. Again, that salt that I'm going to want to put in almost everything, a healthy amount. And then lastly, I need a fat. Mayo is usually oil, and you can use like whatever kind of neutral flavored oil you like. I did a little bit of an extra step to introduce some more flavor here. So I did this ahead of time, again, just to save myself some time here. What I did was take canola oil, and then I took some dried chipotles, put them in the pan, brought it up to heat, and let them simmer for just a little bit. And the reason for that is to soften the chipotles, but then it also infuses that oil with the chipotle flavor. So I can now use this oil, this chipotle oil, in my mayo and have a much like rounder flavor than I would if I just added in some chipotles after the fact. All these little bits of chipotle pepper, I'm actually going to use them in here as well. Just plop them right in. My immersion blender is a very sturdy machine, so it's going to be able to blend through those. And then I'm going to pour the oil on top of my other ingredients as well. I'm looking for about a cup of oil, so I've got a little bit more than I need in this saucepan, but that's fine. One of the things that's really useful, again, in terms of meal prep that we were talking about earlier, is to have just little tasty bits around in your kitchen. Just have like little flavorful components that you can use in a bunch of different ways, just floating around so that you can use them however the mood strikes you. All right, so we've got all of those components in our quart jar. Now all we need to do is put that immersion blender all the way to the bottom and then blend it up. You first want to blend the bottom. You want to blend that egg as much as possible and then slowly start to incorporate the oil. So I'm going to slowly start to like turn my immersion blender so that it starts grabbing some of that oil that's just sitting on top and smoothly emulsify it. And there we go. That's it. We got aioli. this is going to be great with the carnitas. It would also be great in any number of other applications. And now that I've got this sitting in my fridge, I can use it however I want throughout the course of the week. So, I know that doesn't particularly look appetizing, but but I promise it's going to taste good. Nice. As we were talking about earlier, always taste as you go. You can always adjust. It doesn't have to be perfect from the start. You can change it as it goes. There's quite a bit of good heat in there as well from that chipotle. It's nice and smoky and savory. That would make an excellent spread on a sandwich as well, if you like. Okay, we've got beans cooking, we've got carnitas cooking, we made an aioli. The last thing that I want to show you tonight is going to be that apple slaw. So that little bit of like punch of freshness, and then we're also going to have a good amount of acid on here as well, because that's going to round out the richness of all the other components that we've been cooking. I also, as we were talking about earlier, really love apple season, and this is a great way to incorporate a seasonal vegetable. These apples I did actually get from our farmers market, the Dane County Farmers Market. It's not a variety that I had seen before. It's called a Jonafree, but it is delightful. So I'm actually going to start with my dressing. So I've just got a mixing bowl here. I like just a pretty simple dressing to go on slaw. I'm going to be using some white wine vinegar because that's what I have. If I had some apple cider vinegar, I would use that, but you know, do whatever you want. I've got a good amount of vinegar that I'm pouring in there. Acid frequently needs a little bit of sweetness to kind of take the edge off. So I'm going to use a little bit of maple syrup, just a little dredge of that. I am going to use a little bit more of that mustard that we were using for the mayo, and put that in here again, just to kind of bring it all together to help that emulsification. And then I'm also going to put some cumin, which is probably my favorite spice. Truly delicious. Sprinkle that in there. Some salt, and then I'll also put some cilantro in here as well. All right, we'll hit that cilantro in a second, but I'm just going to whisk together all of my components, give that a taste. Yeah, that's good. I'm probably going to need to add more salt once I have all my veggies, because cabbage in particular actually takes a lot more salt than you would expect. All right. Now it's just a matter of chopping up some veggies, which can be nice and therapeutic for you. Here's my cilantro. I'm just going to give that a little chop. Doesn't need to be pretty or crazy. We're just trying to put it into smaller pieces. The stems of cilantro are actually super flavorful as well, so you actually don't need to worry about the small little stems. You can keep those right in there. Let's also do some green cabbage. So I'm gonna chop this guy. Also from the farmer's market. And just take some of those outside leaves that aren't quite as nice, and we'll toss those. I like to cut my cabbage into quarters, and then you can use a mandolin if you like. Mandolins are kind of a dangerous tool, so use with caution. I don't mind just chopping it by hand personally. There we go. Oops. Another thing down on the floor for me. Just break up that cabbage. And then I'll chop up some apple to go in here as well. You can kind of just cut off each of the cheeks of the apple, and then cut it into small little strips. If you like to practice your knife skills, this is a great place to do it. But also, if you don't like to practice your knife skills, it doesn't matter. It doesn't, like, this isn't a Michelin starred restaurant. It doesn't need to be crazy. It just needs to be in little bite-sized pieces. So I'm just gonna put in one apple, I think. Apples are honestly one of my favorite foods in the world. They're just it's a pretty perfect thing to have around. They last for a pretty long time. It's a beautiful snack, especially if you eat it with some peanut butter or something to make it a little bit more filling. You can also get, because of like that natural sugar in there, you get like almost, I mean, it's not the same as caffeine, but you get kind of a boost from it in the same way that you would a cup of coffee, which is really, really nice. A nice way to get some quick energy from your food. All right. Almost there. Just going for like a rough julienne here, like little matchsticks of the apple, to kind of match the shape-ish of the cabbage. I'm gonna finish this off with a little squeeze of lemon juice as well. And then if you're feeling spicy, you can also put a little bit of jalapeno in. Oh, I think my little lemon juicer isn't quite big enough. I'm gonna reach over into this drawer for my big fancy orange juicer. Ooh, spraying everywhere, but that's okay. We'll clean it up later. Nice little orange freshness. You gotta connect the dots between the other things that we were cooking tonight as well. I'm gonna do just a super quick mince on a little bit of jalapeno and add that in as well. If you don't like the spiciness so much, you can take out the ribs and the seeds. If you really like spicy, you can leave those in. A lot of times I have pickled jalapenos around, just in the fridge. I'll pickle them myself and then keep them around. Pickled onion as well, just a really, really nice little acidic condiment to have around. I don't happen to have any already pickled jalapenos right now, so I'm just using fresh. Again, have fun with it. Just do whatever you want. Learn from it. And there we go. I'm just gonna toss this together. Let that all get combined. And this is no, like I said, this is no super fancy thing, but see how beautiful and fresh that looks? That really, really nice, fresh, like crunchy bite is gonna be just wonderful with those nice, rich, like savory carnitas that we made earlier. As I mentioned earlier, my favorite way to eat this is probably gonna be on a taco, but you can do anything you want. That's really good. My guess was correct earlier. It does need just a little bit more salt, but that's super easy. And now I've got a really nice little salad that can just hang out with in my fridge. So bringing it back full circle to those takeaways that I was trying to kind of demonstrate for you. Cook from whole ingredients wherever you can. Cook locally and seasonally. Do some meal prep to make your life easier. Reduce waste. Use up everything in your fridge if you can, and have fun. Okay, so that's everything that I wanted to demonstrate. So I think we can go to Q&A now.
So if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat box, and I'll be reading those, and I'll pass these on to Megan. But in the meantime, I came up with a few questions while she was cooking. So could you explain what across the grain means?
Yeah. So if you've ever taken a look at a piece of meat, at a muscle, the muscle fibers kind of all grow in the same direction. that can get like kind of stringy as you're chewing it. So when you want to cut meat, you actually, whatever direction the grains are growing, those fibers are growing, you want to cut perpendicular to them. So you're kind of cutting those fibers into shorter little pieces so you don't have like one long stringy bite. It just makes the texture of the meat nicer.
Think I can ask through here. So one of the other questions I came up with is you boned out.
Mhm.
Could you keep the bone in for something like this?
You could. It's just not going to cook quite as evenly. But there are certainly other ways. Like if you do want to leave your bone in, you could definitely like braise it. You could do like an entire braised pork shoulder. Just use like some sort of like cooking vessel or something like that. Put a little bit of liquid in there. Stock would be an excellent choice. You can put a little bit of like, again, orange juice if you want or whatever, and then cover that and cook it again at a really low temperature in your oven this time, to let that kind of fall apart. It's not going to do exactly the same thing as the carnitas, where it gets like the little crispy bits, but definitely that braising your bone in roasts or whatever you have is another phenomenal way to prepare them.
So some like a meal that you could substitute beef or chicken or different type
Yeah,
of meat or keep meat out of it somehow.
definitely. Yeah, yeah. So pretty much any kind of meat you want to use is going to work well. If you want to do beef, I would use another cut that kind of shreds well. And if you're not sure what that is, that's totally fine. Go ask your butcher. They would love to. They would love to tell you. You could definitely do chicken. Honestly, a great non-meat alternative is not going to work quite the same way, and it actually doesn't need nearly as much time. But mushrooms are a phenomenal substitute for meat in general. Like a really nicely cooked mushroom is just amazing. There are far fewer varieties of mushrooms in the grocery store than I would like. My favorite kind that I've come across so far is actually just an oyster mushroom, but that's going to be available at farmers markets almost all the time, and it just cooks up gorgeously and has like a pretty similar texture to meat, if you treat it the right way.
A question from the chat was, how long do you marinate this slaw for?
It's actually ready to eat right away. You can let it marinate for a couple of days if you like. The apples might go a little bit brown, but that's okay. It's still going to taste great. But it would be ready to go as soon as you prepare it.
Yep. One person was asking if you could speak on how this type of dish would relate to like heart health. Looks like there's a lot of pork,
Mhm.
lots of salt, lard, and is there a reason for using lard rather than an unsaturated option?
Yeah, so I am certainly not a doctor, so take anything that I have to say with that caveat in mind. Um, there are certainly reasons why you might want to cook with less salt, but if you don't have a doctor telling you that you want to reduce your salt intake, for the vast majority of people, salt is not a thing to be concerned about. It's just going to help flavor. Um, if you do need to reduce your salt, you can certainly do that. That's Salt is really only a flavoring compound, and anything that we did here is just going to bump up that flavor. But you can do with less or without. In terms of the fat, I just personally really like lard. I like the flavor. I think that it imparts like much more of the porkiness. But again, if you have a doctor telling you that you need to adjust whatever fats you're using so that you use like an unsaturated fat, that's totally fine. You can totally do that. Again, be flexible. That's totally great.
On the salt, could you restate how you calculate how much salt to add?
Yeah, so it's going to be about 2% of the weight of your meat. So if you happen to buy it from a grocery store or something that tells you the weight, you can do that. Otherwise, I highly recommend having a kitchen scale, and just weigh how much meat you have. Take 0.02 of whatever that amount is, and then that's going to be the weight of salt that you put on there.
Okay. Another question was, can you recommend flavor boosters if you were not trying to use the fat as much?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the there's always other options. Fat just happens to be a really easy way to emphasize flavor. Something that we chefs like to say is that fat is flavor. It's kind of like that carrying compound. that will help express flavor. But if you need to avoid that, you can also lean a lot on your aromatic compounds. You can add more of your onions, your garlic. You can add more spices. All of those different things while reducing your fat as well.
Someone asked, are you going to be able to try some for everyone?
Oh, do you want to try some? I
I'd
feel
love
like
to try
it's
some,
it's
sure.
biased if I try it.
Yeah, sure.
I don't have any tortillas here, unfortunately, but I can put together a small plate for Jacob to take a taste of. Let's do this. Unfortunately, also our beans are still cooking. I was a little bit ambitious with the beans, but I'll get some of our carnitas and some of our slaw and our aioli.
So I've tried to make homemade mayo before and failed miserably.
Yeah.
Is there a secret to it? Like, what was the temperature of the oil?
Oil is just room temp.
Okay.
The biggest key is honestly going to be introducing the fat slowly. So I manage that by using that quart container and blending it with the immersion blender like stuck to the bottom. And then just slowly lifting that up so that the oil could slowly incorporate. But you can also achieve that with a food processor or a blender if you just start with your egg and everything else in the bottom of your blender and slowly drizzle in your oil. Mayo can be a little bit finicky, but honestly, this immersion blender method is the most foolproof method that I've ever seen. And it's all about just taking it slowly, adding that oil as slowly as you possibly can. Is it okay?
It's really good, yeah. All right. There's been a lot of good feedback. One other question I had: what are some of the main differences like between cooking at home versus cooking at a restaurant?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of differences. One of the big things in a restaurant is that you want to do as much prep work as possible so that when you're preparing it to send it out the window, that takes as little time as possible. It's also much more a question of looking at your system overall and making sure that you have like a well-stocked pantry so that you can manage your overall amount of prep goods and food responsibly and running margins as tight as you can because restaurants are such a hard business with very razor thin margins. That said, there's also a lot of advantages to it. You get to work with a bunch of other crazy people just like you, and you have access to all sorts of fun ingredients and stuff like that. At home, I feel like there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from that as well, though. You still, even in your home kitchen, definitely want to be maintaining a well-stocked pantry. You want to be making sure that you're not, like we talked about, you want to reduce your waste. You don't want to have too much stuff around that you're just not using. But it doesn't have to be crazy. You don't have to have it ready for someone who's paying for it in 3 minutes who you don't want to disappoint. If it's just you and your family, you can get over it if it's not stellar. So in that sense, I think it's just really a lot of practice and being able to really trust your recipes and trust that you can do it perfectly right now, as opposed to your home kitchen. You can be a little bit more flexible, have a little more fun.
We do have a few more events through the rest of the 2023. So in October, we are going to be having a virtual bingo. So keeping it lighthearted, have more of a fun opportunity. So probably have some prizes available for that. So if you want to sign up, that you can do that through our website. We'll also be sending out an invitation link later on. Some of the other ones. In November, we are going to do a charity drive for Sleep in Heavenly Peace. So we'll be announcing some details on what that entails. So keep an eye out if you want to participate in that. And then December, our last one, is going to be talking about finances and passing it on to the next generation, how to incorporate your children or your grandchildren into your financial plans. So that'll be a virtual event as well. So keep your eyes out and ears out for more details about that. So once again, I want to thank you for joining us and for uh, participating with all these events that we've been doing. We hope that you are enjoying them. And if you have any feedback, please feel free to send us an email, talk to your financial advisor, let them know what you thought about this. If there's something you want to see more of, we can do that. Something you're not interested in, we would like to tailor this to your ends, but hopefully you're able to take some tips and incorporate it into your life and make it better. So again, thank you. Thank you again, Megan. Did a fantastic job. And yes, go try that recipe. It's great.